Welcome to the Ruthless Criticism Podcast. Today is Sunday, May 13th, 2018. And it's been a busy couple weeks, which is why I have not had too many posts up recently. I did not complete all the editing that I wanted to on the May Day coverage that I did, which, although minimal, did have two additional interviews, one by Serve the People San Jose and one by one of the organizers of the May Day events. Additionally, over the past week, I attended a gubernatorial debate at San Jose State University. Got a couple of interviews there as well. So I would like to release those at some point. Needless to say, the debate was not very impressive. Although it was interesting in the sense that there were multiple candidates from not necessarily parties, because there was a Democratic candidate for governor that was on the panel, but just different spheres of sort of political ideology, so to speak. There was Gloria La Riva, who was on the panel from the PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation, which is running on the Peace and Freedom ballot. There were two libertarians, or at least one official libertarian candidate and another self-styled libertarian, Nicholas Wildstar, and again, a Democratic Party candidate and a Green Party candidate as well. Come to find out, there was actually two additional Green Party candidates who were not the endorsed candidate. And in speaking with the Green Party candidate for governor after the debate, someone who I know slightly personally, Josh Jones, he is the endorsed Green Party candidate. It apparently is the case that the endorsement protocol that was put in place was essentially an attempt to sort of do a pseudo primary. It seems that there's some infrastructural or systemic sort of barriers with respect to running an actual primary for the Green Party. So they went through an endorsement process, which basically, similar to a primary, says, at least among the Green Party members, who were they endorsing as their candidate for governor. The other two candidates I actually had an opportunity to speak with after the debate, and so hopefully I'll have some of that coverage released as well. Let me just say that the endorsed or official candidate for the Libertarian Party, Zoltan Istvan, is, to put it mildly, insane. And while I don't disagree with the premise of his approach, which is essentially to look at how technology or science is able to advance us into the future, it's pretty clear that his policies and how he believes that is going to occur is coming from an obvious political bias. And to give an example of this, the topic of school shootings came up, and I guess school violence in general, or, criminality on campus in general. And his proposal for this was essentially to allow drones and robots to sort of patrol campuses across California, and this would be a private endeavor, of course. So basically what we would end up with is these private drone and robot forces that did some sort of enforcement. It's not clear 100% whether or not he was implying that these drones and robots would actually be used, for example, as was the case in Texas, to say, like, blow up a shooter, by having a bomb attached to them or something in the event of a mass shooting. But it was clear at a minimum that he was talking about cameras, perhaps thermal imagery and things of that nature, which to me, the primary issue here obviously raised is privacy concerns. We have enough surveillance through the state, and surveillance of private companies is not much better and arguably worse, since then we have very limited insight. But beyond that, I think it's interesting also that he doesn't introduce any sort of racial or class analysis into this. And he doesn't seem to distinguish between how these private drones and robots would be used on, say, a campus that was comprised predominantly of black students or people of color in general, and how that would differ from, say, a campus that is largely white. Certainly the biases that we see with respect to law enforcement in how they react to white suspects versus black suspects, that alone should make us very concerned with the idea that we would place these types of tools in the hands not only of the private companies, but even campus police, which, particularly on the SJSU campus, don't have a very good track record in this regard. In 2014, for example, SJSU police shot and killed Antonio Guzman Lopez, a local resident of San Jose, who was walking nearby the campus with a drywall saw. Given that context, it's not particularly clear how placing drones and robots with cameras and or thermal imagery on a campus, wherein police are obviously willing to react, particularly to people of color, with violence in the face of any sort of perceived threat, regardless of how real or dangerous it actually is, would improve a situation with respect to violence. Quite the contrary, it would seem to increase the amount of violence by putting these police officers in a situation where they're now responding to every little possible perceived threat with much more widespread attention because of the amount of surveillance. Interestingly, not too far after that, during the discussion of the topic of free tuition, Mr. Istvan decided that it was prudent for him to make an argument that free tuition was essentially pointless because education would be changed so rapidly by technology that within the next 5 to 10 years or so, essentially all the existing institutions for higher education would be moot. That is to say that our campuses would be empty, and that education, rather than being this sort of social activity wherein people congregate into places and learn from other people, would be a matter of brain implants and chips and things like that, where we simply download information into our heads. And of course, he cited such luminaries as Elon Musk, who said this is within 4 years there would be a product that would be capable of doing this based on the current state of the technology. Now, it seems to me you can't make both arguments here. Either we should be trying to invest money into campuses, particularly around this issue of surveillance with drones and robots, or you should be looking towards the future where these campuses are essentially abolished in favor of some sort of direct download mechanism of information into the brain. Otherwise, it's not clear at all why you would have a attempt to incentivize or create a market response to the issue of campus violence when you could just create a market response and incentivize the destruction of college campuses across California. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying I agree with one of these positions over the other. Quite the contrary, I think they're both clearly insane positions, but the positions do seem contradictory to me. Lastly, in addition to these two positions, Mr. Istvan seemed to have what I would consider semi-genocidal tendencies towards the homeless. He frequently complained throughout the debate, even on questions that weren't really directly related to the topic, about the concerns that he faced as a parent with respect to the homeless population growing in his area. And at one point he noted that, there's various solutions that one would have to take, but essentially that they'd have to be moved somewhere else, or quote unquote, whatever it takes. In the context of his response, the amount of disdain that he had expressed prior to was quite concerning when someone brings up a phrase like whatever it takes, because, whatever it takes covers a wide range of possible solutions, including a final solution of sorts, if we should use that phrase. Now, it's totally possible that I am being completely hyperbolic on this, but I think given the context and the sort of emotional response that he had to this issue, I'm actually not thinking this is as hyperbolic as you might be interpreting it as. While I do have independent audio, which I recorded from the debate, the San Jose Peace and Justice Center was also recording video. And although I'm not sure it's the San Jose Peace and Justice Center's video, it does appear that Nicholas Wildstar has posted a video of the SJSU gubernatorial debate on his YouTube channel. So I will link to that in the description below. And you can check out Zoltan Istvan's response to these questions for yourself, and you be the judge. All that being said, the topic of today's podcast is actually really nothing related to any of the stuff that I just mentioned. I just thought I'd give you a brief update on what I've been doing and what the sort of local news is like around here. Much rather, today I want to talk about value. And in particular, I want to talk about use value in the Marxian sense. And the reason I want to focus on use value is twofold. For one, I don't think that it's paid enough attention to in Marxist circles simply because Marx sort of takes it as a given. That's not to say that he doesn't elucidate the concept or, in my mind, express the differences between this type of value versus other types of value. I think that's made clear as you begin to explore the relationship between use value and exchange value in Marx's writing. However, the use value question is particularly interesting with respect to our pro-capitalist critics of Marx because the quote-unquote subjective theory of value relies on this concept of marginal utility. And it's the closest analog we have. So I think by analyzing some of the differences between the Marxian concept of use value and the concept that is expressed in terms of marginal utility or subjective theory of value, we can sort of get at the heart of some of these issues here. So let's begin by talking about what a use value is, or what use value is, I should say. Sometimes I say what a use value is because in Marxist terms, a commodity is a use value, or that is at least one side of a commodity. It's also other types of values, but to say a use value is simply to say that this is sort of an expressive form of a particular commodity. So a car is a use value. A house is a use value. And this may all seem pretty easy to understand in the context of what I'm saying right now, because when people think of these things, they immediately understand the utility that these commodities provide. And when we talk about abolishing commodities, we're not talking about abolishing use value. Rather, a commodity being a container, so to speak, for multiple forms of value, or an expression of multiple forms of value, would be stripped of the superfluous forms of value and be left only really with this essential form, which is use value. Now, it's often said that utility in the Marxist sense is a binary. Now, to clarify this, we then have to make a distinction simply between a thing or a good versus a commodity. Obviously, things would still be produced for use, but if they don't take on the commodity form, then we can't really call them a commodity. A commodity is not something that is simply produced. It's not whatever you happen to find in the woods, right? So land is not a commodity. If you come across a perfect walking stick that has been naturally formed in the forest, the stick alone is not a commodity. In order for something to be a commodity, it is an essential requirement that it has to be produced and distributed via a market or via the exchange relation. So a commodity becomes something wherein labor has been invested for the purpose that this thing will be exchanged in the market, and then it is placed in the market for exchange in order to be distributed for use. So if instead of just sort of happening upon a walking stick in the woods, one is to set out into the woods to find a number of sticks that would make sufficient or perhaps even very nice walking sticks. And the intention of this is to commit that labor to the aggregation of all these walking sticks, and then to place those into the market, maybe with some additional labor added to clean them up or whatever. But to place them into the market for sale, then walking sticks in this sense would be a commodity. But simply by discovering a walking stick or a stick that is suitable for using as a walking stick does not alone make that good a commodity. That said, because we are focused mostly on utility, I'm going to try and exclude the use of commodity language in this because it's not really relevant to the questions that we're trying to explore in this particular podcast. So returning then to the utility of a thing or a good that's not necessarily a commodity. The Marxian concept of utility, again, is often said to be a binary. That is to say that something either has utility or it does not. It's either on or off. There's no circumstance in which you have where you say that this thing is somewhat useful or that it is mostly useful or less useful. And the reason for this is that we're focused on a particular relationship when we're talking about utility. So in the context that we're concerned with, the utility of an object is an intersection between subjective desires and the objective properties of the object. In order to have a concept of most useful or least useful, generally what is being compared there is the relative differences between two objects. So it's really becomes a totally different relationship that we're concerned with when we start talking about comparative utilities, right? If I say that a car is more useful than a bike for getting to my job, then I have now changed the relationship between the subject and the original object, the car, to be a comparison or even an analysis between two objects. That is a relationship between two objects instead of the relationships between the object and the subject. The more critical point here, however, is that even if one is to make those comparisons and to say that one object is more useful or less useful, then what we really mean to say by this is that there is a larger intersection between the objective properties of the object and the desires of the person, or a smaller intersection between those properties of the object and the desires of the person. It is not utility in an abstract sense. So we can't separate the fact that there's this intersection from what those specific objective properties are. Nor is there any way to quantify this independent of the actual qualitative properties of the object. What does this mean? So let's say that I'm baking a cake and I have two options for different types of flour. I could use almond flour to bake my cake, or I can use regular sort of ordinary wheat flour. Now, both of these may be useful in the sort of generalized concept of baking a cake. However, both of these are not useful if I actually have a particular recipe for a cake. And although it's possible in baking to generally swap one ingredient for something that's somewhat comparable, there are obviously different properties to these two distinct types of flour, and that not only changes how they affect the cake in terms of the recipe overall, what the texture of the cake is, what the consistency of the cake is, but it also affects obviously the nutritional value of the cake. So someone who is on a ketogenic diet, for example, is going to want to avoid a wheat flour or a grain-based flour, whereas a nut flour like almond flour or even something like coconut flour may be wholly acceptable in terms of what their desires are. And this is because their desire is to limit carbs, right? Or their desire is to produce a cake with certain caloric or nutritional values, which then requires certain conditions to be met by the object in order for it to be useful for baking that cake. Now, it may of course be true that our desires are not particularly specific in any given context. That is to say, maybe I'm not so much concerned with baking a cake in particular, but I just want something sweet, right? So it doesn't particularly matter that whether it's a cake or a cookie or a chocolate bar. My concern is sweet, and it doesn't even necessarily particularly matter whether or not it's sugar or stevia or something of that nature. It's then true that you may have multiple different goods that will fulfill a use value. However, on the question of what we're talking about, and this would be the question of sweetness, there is a particular quality that each of these goods needs to have in order to fulfill that. So, for example, I can't say that I want something sweet, and therefore I'm going to eat a Dorito. It just doesn't make sense to say that the qualitative properties of that good would fulfill the particular desire that I have at the time. That is to say that the intersection between my desires and the properties of the good which fulfill that desire is essentially zero. Now, the question then is, are there situations where, for example, I say I want something sweet, and we can talk about sweetness as some sort of gradation, right? So that the more sweet a thing is, the more useful it is to me. I would argue that this is not so much a matter of the object, but rather an imprecision in the subjective desires that we have. And some desires are very precise. So, for example, if I need a bolt of a specific size, one, I need to be concerned with the actual coarseness of the threading. I need to be concerned with the size of the threading, the internal and external diameter. I need to be concerned with the length of the bolt to make sure that it's long enough to actually go through everything I need it to go through. Or if I require a nut on the other side, that it's long enough that I can place the nut on it. There's all these questions that make the utility of a bolt a very precise thing, whereas the utility of a chocolate bar may be less so. You know, it may not be the case that I absolutely need a Snickers bar versus a Twix. But this is not an expression of some sort of differing abstract utility of the object itself. This is a matter of the precision of our desires. It's not appropriate to say that a Snickers bar is more useful than a Twix unless you can say more useful for what. And if you say more useful for what, then it's either useful or it's not, because the more precise you get in defining what the desire is, then the more constraints you place on the objective properties that need to be fulfilled in order for that thing to be useful. The only way to be able to say that one thing is less useful is to say that you have left out some of the constraints of your particular desire. This also isn't to say that people can't regret decisions or perhaps feel that something would be more useful. So perhaps there is a case where I say, okay, I want something sweet, and the sweeter the better. What this really amounts to is a prediction of potential future regret. That is to say, if I eat this sweet thing, it may not be sweet enough to actually fulfill the desire that I have, and therefore I'm going to regret eating it because now I have consumed something that hasn't fulfilled the utility or hasn't fulfilled the desires. So that is to say that I think its properties may not intersect with my particular desire at the moment. They may be similar in some way, or it may intersect with some of them, but it doesn't intersect with the complete desire that I have, and therefore I'm questioning whether or not this will actually fulfill my desire. Obviously, then the result is that someone eats something sweet, it's not sweet enough, and they still want something sweet. And in a very similar vein as that is the amount of a thing. You know, you sit down and you open your pint of ice cream and you say, okay, I just want a little bit of ice cream. I just have a desire for something sweet. I don't desire 500 calories right now, so I'm going to go ahead and eat a couple spoonfuls, then I'm going to put it away and be satisfied. Of course, that's never the case, and we end up eating the whole pint anyway. So what does this express? Now, there's two different options. One is there is a question of imprecision. Maybe you have simply not been precise enough with respect to your desire about the quantity you want, or maybe you misjudged your own desire. But what does that really sort of say about what we're talking about? We have to admit that desires change. And this is something that is true in both the Marxian analysis of value in utility, as well as marginal utility or subjective theory of value with respect to utility. It's wholly possible for you to eat some ice cream and then, having eaten some ice cream, want more ice cream. Even if you didn't want all that ice cream at the beginning, the effect of the ice cream on your body has now changed your desires. So both of these theories have to take into account that someone's desires will change over time. So currently both theories rely on these two sort of distinct postulates, right? There's the postulate that utility in itself is an overlap between subjective desires and objective properties of an object. And then there is the postulate that the subjective desires can change, and therefore which objects fulfill those uses will also change, or which objects have utility to the person will change. And this, of course, changes with the circumstances. So, for example, if I want to fix my car and the problem is that I have a broken starter, once I acquire that starter, the condition which made the starter desirable is now gone. And marginalists would say that this may be true in the case of something where you only need one, or you only want one. However, it is not true in the case of, say, I think the classic example is like some sort of grain. That is to say, generally, the examples that are provided are things that simply have multiple utilities. There's a bit of an obfuscation going on here already. What is relied upon in the example is the idea that something may have multiple uses, and therefore it has a higher likelihood of having utility for that person. So in the case of grain, and what I think is often postulated as like grain for a farmer, there are multiple uses for that grain. He can use it to feed his animals, he can use it to feed himself, and he can potentially use it, depending on the type of grain, to even plant more grain. As someone who homebrews, it is clear to me that if I buy barley, for example, I could say consume barley meal, or perhaps I could feed barley to my chickens, which I don't actually have, but I can also sprout the grain for malt, or I can plant the grain, and once sprouted will obviously grow into, hopefully, a successful barley plant to reproduce more barley. These are all valid uses for barley. However, each use is a different case of utility. That is to say, each use is a different desire for which it just so happens that the objective properties of barley intersect with all of those independent desires. So a theory of marginal utility looks at all these uses and then says, well, someone can basically list their desires in an ordinal fashion. That is to say, I can say that the thing that I desire most is a bowl of barley meal. Second to that, I really want to malt the grain for some beer. Third to that, I'm concerned with feeding my chickens. And last but not least, I am definitely concerned with growing more barley so that I have more for the future. The marginalist then proposes that because I'm able to order these particular desires in terms of which one I want more or want least, I am then able to discern what is a marginal benefit to additional quantities of barley. That is to say, if I can only afford or have the means to acquire 10 pounds of barley, that first 10 pounds of barley is going to go towards the things that I want the most, and therefore is going to be considered more valuable than, say, the next 10 pounds, because that next 10 pounds will only be used after I fulfilled my primary want for barley, and therefore it will only fulfill secondary or less important wants. Additionally, it's then proposed that because I can order my desires in this fashion, not only can I determine a difference in value of things which are similar, that is, the first 10 pounds of barley versus the second 10 pounds of barley, but I can also compare in an abstract sense of utility different things altogether. So, if I want to fix my car more than I want to brew beer, I would value a starter for my car higher than the barley. Now, this isn't to say that Marx didn't have such a conception of ordered desires. However, if he had such a conception, he didn't think it particularly useful for explaining the type of value which he was trying to explain. This means that between the two theories of utility or use value, in a sense, Marx's theory requires one less postulate, and that is, namely, the ability to order our desires preferentially. At first glance, this may seem like a significant oversight. How can we possibly talk about utility and desires without talking about a particular preference in terms of which desire I want over another? Well, for Marx, the question of utility was a question of immediate want. And the term that is important here is the term immediate, because as we already discussed, both of these theories have to accept a postulate that desires can change with time. So, at least from a standpoint of the theoretical underpinnings, the idea that you prefer X more than Y is not so much a comparison between some abstract utility between the two things, rather it is a projection of the immediacy of the want. That is to say, if I can fulfill X now, which is my most immediate want, then Y is going to be my next immediate want. It is a projection of your desires into the future. Of course, because what you actually do and the things you consume affects your desires, either by satiating a particular desire or by perhaps triggering your body to have a new desire in the case of your ice cream, the act of utilizing something alone affects whether or not something else will be useful to you. So if I'm attempting to replace the starter on my car and I shear a bolt which then needs to be drilled out, it is now the case that the utility of the drill might be my most immediate want. The concept of immediate want and the ability for desires to change over time is far more effective at explaining the types of behavior we see. So, for example, if you go to a grocery store, marginalists would have you believe that you create a list in your head of what is most to least desirable that you think you'll find at the grocery store. And of course, very many people do create grocery lists, but very few people order it according to some marginal utility. Rather, they have a total budget which they intend to spend at the grocery store, and they get as many things as they think they'll be able to fit into that budget. This isn't to say that whatever items didn't make the list because they didn't have enough money have no utility ever to them. It's merely to say that they project that the utility of that thing to them is of less immediacy. That is, they won't actually want it or need it until some time has passed in which they might be able to acquire more means of acquiring it. This also explains why, despite whatever list of marginal benefit and ordered preferences you've come up with at the beginning, according to the marginalist, over the course of a week, your desires and wants will change. So it's wholly possible that in projecting your immediate wants throughout the week, you made a mistake and at some point your desires changed, therefore making something that you purchased earlier no longer useful to you. And this is why it should come as no surprise that you will end up sometimes with things you might have purchased months ago which haven't even been opened yet. Or perhaps you will get something in your fridge and it will go bad before you even use it. Now, when we talk about an immediate want and the notion that that immediate want changes, this admits to a near complete instability in what our immediate wants might be. You can, of course, project a number of future immediate wants and try and predict what your immediate wants will become over the week. Yet, as soon as you enter into that checkout aisle, you see something relatively cheap that all of a sudden you feel an immediate want for. Now, let's say that your budget is so strict that you absolutely cannot afford the extra $1.50. Do you, as the marginalist propose, pull out your grocery list which is ordered by marginal benefit, or do you instead turn to your cart and say simply, which of these things am I not planning to use for the longest amount of time? Of course, this calculation takes in many other things into account in a world of exchange and commodity production. If the thing that you have to give up isn't enough to cover the cost of the thing that has now become your immediate want, then it's not going to really serve you any purpose in giving it up. This complex process of planning and prediction with respect to our immediate wants and the inevitable perturbations that are caused by an economy that is dominated by exchange relations make it easy to see why marginalists fall into this trap of trying to explain such things with a concept of abstract utility. But however rapidly or easily our immediate want changes, or however complex and imprecise the prospect of predicting our immediate want into the future become, the marginalist theory, which requires an abstract utility, provides no additional explanatory power while requiring the additional postulate of how this utility becomes abstract. Again, the usefulness of an object depends on that object's properties and those specific properties intersecting with our desires. This cannot be abstracted from the object. I can't say that my car is more useful than my house. The question must arise, more useful for what? And as soon as one begins to answer that question, then they begin to place constraints on the object. The notion then of abstract utility vanishes, and we're left only with the concrete utility of specific objects to fulfill specific desires. The ease with which our brain predicts future wants makes the confusion of marginalists easily excused. But the reason that Marx's analysis stands superior is because of his materialist conception. It is the material constraints of reality which force me to have only one want at one time. With only two hands with which I can act, it is not so easy for me to say that I want to eat ice cream and want to fix my car. So I have to say that I want to do one first, then the other. Or perhaps, at the very best, do a little bit of one, then do a little bit of the other, then return again to the first. By idealizing human activity outside of a temporal concept, this forces the marginalist to believe that we order our preferences at any given instance. And so the theory of marginal utility arises to explain what is already explained by our material constraints. The physical limitations of our body, the physical limitations of the resources which we have, and the physical limitations of time. But by attempting to explain desires in this idealized fashion, the marginalist only invokes a concept of abstract utility that requires further explanation. How can I compare two qualitatively different things in a quantifiable way? It's clear to me how 3 eggs can have a different use from a cup of cream. It's not clear how it can have more or less use. If you like this podcast or you found it insightful in any way, please leave a comment, thumbs up, and as always, make sure that you subscribe.